the cabin hummed with the low thrum of engines and the soft percussion of ice clinking in glasses. In the press of business suits and tailored dresses, she sat in 22C, folded small against the window, as if she could make herself vanish into the curve of the fuselage. Her hoodie was gray, the cuffs stretched and frayed. The sneakers at her feet were scuffed, laces uneven, one knot double-tied and the other barely holding on. Her jeans sagged at the knees, faded from years of wear, and her face, bare of makeup, looked pale beneath the overhead light. Strands of dark hair slipped loose from a messy knot, curling damp against her cheek. She looked like she had wandered into the wrong plane, the wrong life, a stranger among the rows of privilege. The first jab came from across the aisle. A man in a navy suit leaned toward his colleague, his tie sharp, his cufflinks flashing as he clicked his laptop shut. "Must have been a sweepstakes," he muttered, loud enough to carry. "There's no way she paid for that seat." His colleague chuckled, nodding as if it were truth, his laughter sliding through the air like oil. 2 rows ahead, a woman in a silk scarf lifted her phone, tilting the camera just enough to catch a blurry frame of the girl in 22C. Her caption typed quick, a smirk tugging her lips. "When thrift store chic crashes business class." Her manicured thumb hit post, and the glow of her screen reflected the satisfaction on her face. A snort of laughter drifted back from the row behind. A young aide in a crisp blazer leaned across his armrest to whisper to the woman beside him. "Brings down the standard, doesn't it? Like the airlines trying to run a charity." His voice was smooth, practiced for politics, but the cruelty was sharp underneath. The woman in 22C kept her eyes fixed on the oval window, the night sky stretching endless beyond the glass. Her hands rested loosely on her lap, her fingers pale and still, but the rise of her shoulders betrayed the weight of every word. She didn't move, didn't defend herself, just let the disdain wash over her like cold rain. A sudden splash interrupted the rhythm. A paper cup tipped over on the tray table across the aisle, sending apple juice running in a small wave. The liquid streaked down her sleeve, soaking into the fabric of her hoodie. She turned, and there he was, a boy no older than 6, his pigtail-haired sister clutching crayons beside him. His eyes were wide, his lips pressed tight. Then, almost shyly, he reached into the packet in his hand and held out a single red gummy bear, his fingers sticky with sugar. She blinked at him, a faint crease forming at the edge of her mouth, not quite a smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft, carrying a warmth the others had not earned. She brushed the wet sleeve with one hand, the other tugging her backpack closer beneath the seat. Her thumb lingered on a small patch stitched into the fabric, a faded emblem, wings crossed by a sword so worn it was barely visible. To anyone else, it was meaningless. To her, it was a tether. The murmurs returned soon enough, a ripple running down the cabin. Chuckles disguised as coughs, glances sharp as blades, lips pressed into smirks. The hedge fund man leaned back with a shake of his head. The fashion blogger typed again. The aide chuckled into his phone. The storm built quietly, not in thunder, but in whispers, each one heavier than the last. She absorbed it all in silence, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady on the dark horizon outside. The boy across the aisle popped a gummy bear into his mouth and kept watching her, eyes full of something the others had lost long ago, belief that sometimes the person you least expect carries the greatest weight. The first tremor rolled through the cabin like a warning, a subtle shudder that rattled the trays and set the ice cubes tinkling in half-finished glasses. At first, no one thought much of it. Turbulence was part of flying, something to be endured with tightened seatbelts and forced smiles. But then the second jolt came, harder, sharper, a violent lurch that made the overhead bins rattle and a bottle of champagne topple from a cart. Gasps erupted, a chorus of startled voices rising all at once. The lights flickered briefly before steadied, the engine's steady hum vibrating with a deeper growl. The intercom clicked, a pause heavy with static, then the captain's voice cut in, strained and clipped. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation. It was enough to turn every head, to freeze hands mid-gesture, to stop the whispering tide that had filled the cabin minutes before. Murmurs swelled instantly, fed by fear. The lawyer in row 17 shot up in his seat, his voice loud, as if volume could steady the plane. I demand to know what's happening. I have rights here. I have a right to be informed. His words carried like an accusation, throwing fuel on panic. A CEO with salt and pepper hair muttered to no one in particular, his voice low but urgent. It's terror. It has to be. They don't use that tone unless it's bad. His assistant nodded, pale, clutching the leather handle of her briefcase like it was a lifeline. 2 rows ahead, the influencer in her crimson blazer already had her phone raised, her front camera trained perfectly on her pale but perfectly angled face. We are literally in the middle of a crisis, she whispered into her live stream, her voice trembling just enough to seem authentic. Her followers lit up the screen with comments she didn't read, her gaze darting from the lens to the window with every tremor of the fuselage. In the back of the cabin, a senator leaned close over his phone, his words short and metallic, the language of politics and control. No, don't release a statement yet. I'll advise once I have confirmation. His tone was sharp, businesslike, but his eyes never once moved toward the frightened faces around him. His focus was on optics, not the people strapped into seats around him. Through it all, the woman in 22C didn't stir. She stayed by the window, her hoodie pulled low, her fingers laced loosely in her lap. Her gaze was fixed beyond the glass where faint shadows moved against the stars, dark shapes, too close, too deliberate to be ordinary traffic. The jet tilted slightly, a correction or a command, and the seatbelt sign chimed again. Panic swelled louder in the rows around her, people clutching each other, praying under their breath, cursing the airline, the pilots, the invisible enemy outside. It was then, for the first time since boarding, that she spoke. Her voice was soft but sure, steady in a way that seemed out of place against the chaos. "It'll hold steady for now," she murmured, her words directed at the mother across the aisle. The woman clutched her son tighter, her pearl necklace trembling against her throat, but her eyes flicked to the speaker, something in her expression faltering. The calmness in that tone was unlike anything else in the cabin. The boy, still gripping his gummy bear packet, leaned forward as if he trusted her completely. His mother gave the faintest nod, though her hands kept shaking. A flight attendant, his face pale and smile long abandoned, caught the words as he passed. He slowed for half a second, his eyes locking on her. There was a question in his gaze, something like disbelief. Why was she the only one who seemed untouched by fear? He opened his mouth as if to ask, but the next jolt rocked the cabin, and he hurried down the aisle to tend to a crying passenger. The storm of voices rose again, each passenger louder than the next, each word tangling into the noise. Yet over it all, she sat in silence, her body still, her head tilted slightly toward the window. Her right hand shifted onto the armrest, her fingertips beginning to move in a subtle rhythm. Tap, pause, tap tap, pause. To anyone else, it might have looked like nerves, a meaningless fidget. But the sequence was deliberate, measured, each beat placed with precision. It was the rhythm of a checklist, an aviator's silent prayer: systems, altitude, fuel, weather. Her lips didn't move, but the beats continued, calm and unbroken. While the rest of the cabin unraveled, she seemed to be counting her way back into the sky, piece by piece, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. The cockpit door opened just a crack, and the captain stepped out into the aisle. His uniform was damp at the collar, sweat staining the fabric as though he'd been wrestling the controls with his bare hands. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight, but when he spoke, the strain in his voice was impossible to disguise. "We've been ordered to identify ourselves to approaching fighters," he said, his eyes sweeping the cabin without focus. "But our comms are failing. We can't raise command." For a moment, the words just hung there, like smoke in the air. Then the cabin erupted. Passengers twisted in their seats, their voices rising into a panicked chorus. "What does that mean?" someone cried from the back. "Are we under attack?" A woman clutched her husband's arm, sobbing. The lawyer stood up again, his voice booming. "This is unacceptable. You have to tell us what's happening. You can't leave us in the dark like this." His words were met with scattered shouts of agreement, fear clothed in fury. A man in a blazer slammed his laptop shut, his tone sharp, demanding. "Do something. Somebody, for God's sake," another passenger muttered. "We're sitting ducks." "They're not telling us the truth." The socialite influencer's phone shook in her hand as she live-streamed, her voice shrill, feeding her followers every detail of the unfolding panic. The cabin became a storm of voices, fear twisting into blame. Fingers pointed, fists gripped armrests, and the air grew heavy with dread. And then, quietly, she stood. In 22C, the woman in the hoodie rose, her backpack strap slung across her shoulder. At first, no one noticed, but when she took her first step into the aisle, all eyes turned. There was a pause, then a burst of laughter, cruel and sharp. A businessman leaned across the aisle, sneering. "Sit down, sweetheart. Don't make a fool of yourself." His words sparked others. "Yeah, what's she gonna do?" someone else called. "She looks like she can't even drive a car." But she didn't flinch. Her face was calm, her stride steady as she moved past the jeers. A man tried to block her, standing abruptly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You're going to make this worse," he snapped. She stopped for only a moment, her gaze rising to meet his. Her silence was sharper than any reply. He faltered, sinking back into his seat. The cabin grew quieter as she reached the cockpit door. The co-pilot stood inside, his hands braced against the frame, his expression incredulous. She leaned close, her lips moving in a whisper. His eyes widened, disbelief etched in every line of his face. He shook his head. Then she spoke again, louder this time, clear enough for him to hear but quiet enough to make the passengers lean forward to catch it. "Night Viper 12, former squadron lead, clearance Alpha." The words hit the air like a detonation. For a heartbeat, the cabin was silent. Then, from the back, a voice broke through, a rasping gasp from an older man in uniform, his jacket marked with faded insignia. He half rose from his seat, his face pale with recognition. "Night Viper 12, he whispered. "Impossible. She was lost, years ago." His words carried weight, the kind of authority that froze even the most doubtful. The co-pilot stepped aside, his resistance cracking into stunned silence. She slid into the seat, the headset fitting against her ear as if it had never left. Her hands moved with precision, adjusting dials, steady, controlled. She pressed the transmitter and spoke, her voice cutting through the static, low but firm, each word exact. "Command, this is Night Viper 12. Authentication code follows." The cabin held its breath. The static hissed, stretched, and for a long moment, nothing came back. Then a voice on the other end broke through, disbelieving, frantic. "Night Viper 12. Repeat, did you say Night Viper 12? That's impossible. You were declared KIA 5 years ago." Her gaze stayed steady on the horizon. "I'm here," she said simply. Silence again, this time heavier, like the entire world was trying to recalibrate. Then the comms crackled louder, steadier. "Copy that, diverting Air Force One to escort." The words swept through the cabin like fire. Passengers gasped, some clutching their mouths, others sinking back into their seats, pale and trembling. The lawyer who had demanded rights was silent now. The influencer lowered her phone, her live stream catching only her wide-eyed shock. Even the senator, halfway through a call, stopped mid-sentence, his jaw locked. Outside the windows, the dark shapes of the fighters shifted, breaking their aggressive line and moving into formation, protective now, wings gleaming faintly in the night. The jet was no longer alone. In 22C, her seat remained empty, but the weight of her presence filled every inch of the cabin. The cabin was frozen in an uneasy stillness, a silence so deep it seemed to press against the walls of the aircraft. Only the engine's steady drone filled the void, a reminder that they were still aloft, still hurtling through the dark. Moments earlier, the air had been thick with jeers, with laughter sharp enough to cut. Now it was gone, replaced by open mouths and slack jaws, disbelief carved into every face. The influencer's phone was still raised, though her hand trembled. Her livestream, once a stage for mocking commentary and panicked theatrics, now carried something else entirely. Awe. Millions of viewers watched in real time as her sneer collapsed into wide-eyed silence, the glow of her screen reflecting the truth she could no longer spin. The comments streamed faster than she could read, her humiliation becoming its own spectacle as the narrative flipped before her eyes. She had meant to broadcast fear, to capitalize on disaster. Instead, she had recorded history. The senator shifted in his seat, his phone pressed tightly to his ear though he had stopped speaking long ago. His voice returned in a whisper, muttered to no one in particular. National security protocols. This isn't standard. This isn't. He cut himself short, his hand gripping the armrest until his knuckles whitened. His eyes flicked to the woman in the hoodie, and then away again, as if even looking at her too long might draw unwanted attention. The bravado of politics had drained from him, leaving unease in its place. The lawyer who had shouted about rights, who had demanded answers with the arrogance of a man who believed the world bent to his will, leaned back into his seat. His voice was small now, a rasp barely carried above the hum of the engines. "She's a ghost," he whispered, shaking his head slowly. "She wasn't supposed to exist." The words hung in the air, half confession, half superstition, as though naming her might break the fragile reality they had stumbled into. Not everyone cowered. The boy across the aisle tugged on his mother's sleeve, his small face glowing with joy that seemed too pure for the moment. "I knew she was a hero," he said proudly, his voice carrying enough to draw glances. His mother hushed him, pressing him close, but her own eyes betrayed something new, shame for every glance, every purse of her lips earlier. She squeezed him tighter, perhaps hoping his belief might shield her from the memory of her own doubt. Outside the windows, the night shifted. Escort jets slid into formation, their silhouettes crisp against the stars. Their wings caught faint glints of light, protective angles holding steady on either side of the commercial plane. And then the announcement came through, carried on the radio with a weight that no passenger could misinterpret. Air Force One was diverting, moving to cover her call sign. A living legend, thought lost, had reclaimed her name in the middle of their flight, and the most powerful plane in the world was altering its course to meet her. She didn't bask in it. She didn't rise to meet their awe, didn't lean into the spotlight that had found her. She simply walked back down the aisle, her sneakers soft against the carpet, and returned to 22C. The same seat where they had ridiculed her, the same spot where laughter had cut her like glass. She lowered herself into it quietly, pulled her hoodie tighter, and turned her gaze back to the window. The chatter of disbelief and wonder rippled behind her, but she didn't answer, didn't acknowledge it. Her silence was louder than their applause could ever be. The boy kept watching her, smiling, clutching his crumpled coloring page. A few rows away, the influencer dropped her phone into her lap, her stream still running as she stared in disbelief. The senator pinched the bridge of his nose, muttering fragments of half-formed excuses. The lawyer kept repeating his whisper, as if saying it again might make sense of it. She wasn't supposed to exist. But she was there. Real, solid, undeniable. The light above her shifted as the cabin tilted gently, the escort jets guiding them onto a secure path. Her hand moved slowly, almost unconsciously, to the backpack by her feet. Her fingers brushed the patch stitched into the worn fabric, the emblem catching the dim light. Wings crossed by a sword, sharp and clear now in a way none of them could mistake. Through the window, the same symbol gleamed faintly on the wing of a jet flying close, steady, and protective in the dark. She sat in silence, her breath even, her gaze steady, as though she had always belonged exactly where she was.